Hi there, and welcome to Festival of Place, the Pineapples in association with the Design Council for our lunchtime talk with Owen Hatherley. I'm Christine Murray, I'm the director of the Festival of Place, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here for our talk series running all this week. So you can, just a quick tour of AirMe, please share and introduce yourself in the chat to my right, and feel free to use the emoji button to let us know you're out there and enjoying what you see today. It's the happy face under my face. Yes, perfect, you found it. So it's my great pleasure, thank you, to introduce Owen Hatherley, a renowned writer and journalist, well known for his writings on architecture, culture, and politics. He's the author of several collections of books: Militant Modernism, A Guide to the New Ruins of Great Britain, Uncommon, an Essay on Pulp, A New Kind of Bleak, Journeys Through Urban Britain, Across the Plaza, and Landscapes of Communism. But his new book, Clean Living Under Difficult Circumstances, argues for the city as a social project. So he's going to be talking to us about brutalism today. I'm really looking forward to it. So please emoji applause and welcome, Owen. It's great to have you here. Unmute yourself.
Okay, Julie unmuted. Okay, so thanks. So I'm going to sort of try and sort of summarize as much as I can about brutalism and what sort of happened to it as I can in the space allotted. If I do go over or start repeating myself, do throw things at me in the chat. So I want to begin with something which I think is an example of everything that kind of has gone wrong with the way these buildings have been sort of appreciated and understood. And that would sort of roughly summed up by this image here. So this is the Park Hill Flats in the centre of Sheffield. It was designed in the late 1950s, built in the early 60s by a team at the local authority. And after a kind of long history as a public housing estate, it was given to a private developer in the mid-2000s who gradually cleared every single block. It's a very large, sprawling estate. It's right by the city centre, right by the railway station, sort of almost directly above it. And about 5 kind of interconnected blocks, which have kind of continuous roof line, but are about 2 stories at the lowest point and about 14 at the highest. So they kind of surmount this this ridge at the top of the city. And all of these blocks were kind of cleared of their inhabitants one by one over a period of about 5 years. And this then was followed by a program in which they started to be renovated for a explicitly different class of people. Beginning with a 14-story block, which was very kind of aggressively renovated. Most of the original fabric of the building was removed. Everything really apart from the concrete frame was removed, despite it being a listed building. And initially they were kind of sold as flats aimed very explicitly as people working in either the 2 universities of Sheffield or in the so-called creative classes of Sheffield and the creative industries of Sheffield. This project kind of started in about 2010, 2011. That's when this part started to be sold. The project is still ongoing. They've moved on to the second of the 5 blocks, which is being renovated rather less aggressively, but again, not for public housing tenants, in this case for students. And going along with this is a sort of large marketing campaign, which among other things saw it get nominated for the Sterling Prize, become kind of something of course celeb. And I think the whole thing really could not be described as anything other than a monumental failure. The process of essentially gentrifying the estate has taken longer than the process of building it, and is still unfinished. Most of the building is still derelict. Most of the people who lived in it, many of whom expressed a desire to return, will have no hope of ever living in it again. And a public asset was taken entirely into the private sector. And of course, a whole load of social housing was demolished in a city which has tens of thousands of people on its social housing waiting list. So I think of this very much as a kind of what not to do. But I also want to begin with Park Hill because I want to kind of talk about the kind of ideas behind these buildings, the ways in which those ideas were kind of welcomed and then rejected, and the different ways in which they've kind of recurred over the years, and different ways in which they've recurred, particularly in recent years. The kind of understandings or misunderstandings, let's say, in their kind of re-emergence and their kind of newfound fashionability in the last few years. So I feel I'm already going on too much. So here is a photograph of the same estate in the early 1960s by the photographer Roger Main. And Roger Main was probably best known at the time for his photographs of kind of inner city community life in areas like West London, particularly Notting Hill, and kind of Victorian areas of the north of England. But he also photographed Park Hill very extensively and was actually commissioned by the architects to document Park Hill in its early days. And one of the reasons why they did this is that the architects were very keen in designing Park Hill for it to encourage some form of community life. They believed, rightly or wrongly, that earlier modern housing had been quite kind of cold and slightly desolate and a bit too kind of hygienic and so forth, and that they wanted to kind of build something that would both have kind of modern values to it, but would also kind of encourage people to use its public spaces, to kind of meet each other, to bump into each other, for there to be a kind of degree of accident. And this is particularly through this idea of streets in the sky, which run through the block from the 2nd story to the 10th. But also through the various kind of public facilities. So it had 4 pubs, it had several cafes, it had a butcher shop, post office, various kind of corner shops, 2 schools, several play areas, one of which you can see here. So there was very much this idea that this was very much against the kind of idea that had been associated with modernism before brutalism of zoning. You know, housing goes here, shopping goes here, leisure goes here, schools go there. This was very much not what they were doing. They were trying to kind of have everything kind of happening at once, and it was believed that that would kind of encourage this sense of community. Leaping over to the early 1970s, we can see probably some measure of how this idea kind of fared by the various documentaries that existed from mostly of the 70s, although they kind of endure into the 80s and even into the 90s, where basically a particular kind of person, usually a white middle-class man, stands in front of some public housing, stands in front of some monumental public housing and bellows at you about how it doesn't work. So this would consist of Oscar Newman here outside the Aylesbury estate in South London, Robert Hughes in front of a housing estate in Nanterre outside Paris in the Shock of the New, and Milton Friedman in front of some public housing in Manhattan in his documentary series Free to Choose. This is just the kind of 3 that I think kind of each of them has a particular idea about why this stuff doesn't work, which is worth trying, worth kind of contextualizing. So here's Oscar Newman, author of the famous Study of Defensible Space, which basically argues very, very influentially that that public spaces don't really work, that anything that isn't private, people kind of can't fully understand and can't fully defend because we're sort of naturally aggressive and paranoid animals. There's lots of kind of biological metaphors in there. We did this test on rats and we found this. Therefore, public housing must work in exactly the same way. That happens a lot. And he sort of stands in front of the Aylesbury estate, which was just being finished when he made this documentary for the BBC, and basically claims that, you know, this is going to be a hotbed of crime and misery. There's a recent book by Michael Roman about the Aylesbury estate and its history, which very much takes very strong issue at this. And among the most easily refutable claims is the one about crime. The estate never had particularly higher crime than the area around. In many cases, it's actually had lower. But there's, this idea was very much fixed in people's heads, that these public spaces, kind of like those in Park Hill that you've just seen, were impossible to police, were dangerous, and people couldn't understand. Something similar happens in Robert Hughes' Shock of the New, in the episode of that series about modern art by the Australian historian Robert Hughes. He kind of goes to Nanterre at the end and stands in front of it and basically goes, where are all the people? While he's doing this, there's basically children frolicking around his knees, basically. But nonetheless, where are all the people? No one's here. No one likes it. It's desolate. It's grim. And there's a kind of more complicated thing that's going on, really, although in many ways probably the most malign of all, in Milton Friedman's Free to Choose, where he argues that the combination of public and private uses in modern housing inherently breeds crime and social degradation in much the same way as Oscar Newman, but he brings a kind of new spin to it. Oscar Newman, I think, was coming from the sort of liberal left, and I think very much just wanted communities to get along, and was responding to the very real kind of increase in crime that happened in the 60s and apportioning the blame to architecture, essentially. Milton Friedman, though, was a more straightforward politico-ideological agenda. He was opposed to public housing, full stop. Was opposed to the state or public bodies like local authorities getting involved in the business of housing or getting involved in any business at all. And he used the alleged high crime in public housing as a way of, particularly in kind of this kind of high-rise or monumental or sometimes brutalist housing. I kind of explain why this was necessary. But there's another point there which I think is I think those 3 points are all, I think, deeply freighted by ideology. They are not borne out by and large in statistics or in histories. They're now, I think, fairly discredited, although not in planning departments where defensible space still reigns supreme. But there is another argument which I think was just straightforwardly true, and that was a lot of this stuff was incredibly badly built. And probably the kind of now not very well known, but probably the most interesting failure of all of these is a place called Portsdown Park, which was built between Southampton and Portsmouth, and this is very much the part of the world where I'm from. It's built on a hill overlooking the city of Portsmouth, as a kind of Park Hill style kind of, arrangement of different social functions with housing. It was high rise, with streets in the sky and so forth. Again, on a kind of commanding site above the city. And within about 2 years, it became more or less uninhabitable. The experimental concrete panel construction failed miserably. It was not designed properly for its windy site at the top of the hill. And it had, I think, I'm not totally sure about this, but I think it had the shortest lifespan of any brutalist building. I think that the length of time between its being fully inhabited in the early 70s and it being demolished in the mid 80s, maybe about 10 or 12 years. So it's extremely short-lived. And certain areas and certain departments of housing kind of had very, very high-profile failures. The London Borough of Newham, with a lot of its high-rise blocks, lots of the north of England through a thing called the Yorkshire Design Group, had major structural failures. It's also worth noting that pretty much anything that survives now is likely to be structurally sound, because most of the buildings that were found to be unsound in the 80s and 90s were demolished. So by and large, this is no longer the case, but it was the case for a lot of the stuff. And it had a great effect on people's confidence in these buildings. So zipping along another few years, I want to talk a little bit about public buildings that came along with brutalism, as well as just housing. And this is Birmingham Central Library, designed by the Birmingham architect John Maiden and opened in 1974. And this is an interesting one because of its kind of very dramatic shift in public esteem. It was one of several buildings that was singled out by the heir to the throne, Prince Charles, in his mid-1980s documentary series and book, Vision of Britain, which was full of sort of random insults directed at brutalist buildings, in particular, modern architecture in general, brutalism in particular. The Birmingham Central Library was described as being more like a place where books are burned rather than a place where books are read. And that's probably the nadir of its kind of public reputation is the mid-80s. That's the point where both the kind of social ideas and the architectural fashions are so against this architecture that pretty much anything that survives that is fairly, it only gets better from there on in. And by the 21st century, this building had become a bit of a cult in Birmingham for a lot of people. You would find it in much the same way as the South Bank in London, on a Barbican, on kind of T-shirts, and kind of bits of memorabilia and bits of tat. This did not, however, stop the local authority from demolishing it, which they did for, I think, inferior new library, which has notably much shorter opening hours, just a few yards down the walkways in the centre of Birmingham. But the kind of preservation campaign that really kind of interests me, and that I want to talk about a bit, and that I talk about a lot in the book that I'm supposed to be promoting, is the campaign to save the Tricorn Centre, again in Portsmouth on the south coast. And this is a flyer for the Save Our Tricorn campaign from the early 2000s by a group called Proles for Modernism, which was mostly one person, the poet Andrew Jordan. But they, as well as kind of organising these kind of festivals and protests against the building's demolition, which this is a flyer for, they also put out various kind of pamphlets and arguments about why they thought the Tricorn was important. And what's interesting in these is that they recognise the different conceptions of what failure is and what failure is when you're talking about a building. So for the kind of Tricorn Centre campaigners, the building, roughly speaking, it had been intended as a sort of multi-level shopping mall, very much like the sort of things that would happen in the 1980s in a lot of cities. All of the kind of major retail chains, a big car park, etc., etc., etc. And it had failed for various reasons commercially. And that meant that by the 21st century, it was the place in Portsmouth that had the small record shops, that had the kind of alternative scene, people where the goths went, basically, and was also where the local branch of Laser Quest was, which I think a lot of people felt very much kind of chimed with the building, that it was very much this kind of obstacle course of kind of walkways and turrets, and was already very dramatic and very sort of very science fiction quality to it. So it was the ideal place to do Laser Quest. But this kind of idea of failure, they kind of pointed out, because it failed as a corporate project, it has succeeded for a particular group of people. So yes, it's not what it intended to be. Yes, it did bankrupt the developer, which it did, incidentally. But it works for us. And there's similar arguments that one can make about a lot of other sort of brutalist buildings that failed in their original purpose as major commercial buildings. The Elephant Castle Shopping Centre in South London, recently demolished, is a very good example of that. It was an incredibly, by the time it was demolished, it had basically become a kind of community hub for the local Latin American community. It had pretty much one of the only places where the various kind of otherwise slightly segregated social groups of the area would meet in the bowling alley. It had a place where the elderly would go in the bingo hall above that. It was basically, the kind of mixed-use high street we're all supposed to want, but because it was in a big concrete building that had failed as a commercial shopping mall, this was essentially ignored. Something which I think was a big mistake. So moving back onto the slides, I'm going to talk a little bit about some actual renovations that have happened. So this is the recently renovated Balfron Tower in Poplar in East London, and Grade 2 star listed, very famous architect, very, very well built. Absolutely not a building that's ever had structural problems. Extremely high quality construction and concrete. The renovation of this building, again, like with Park Hill, involved kind of like chucking out the original residents. They had an interesting process sort of between this. I think Park Hill, because of Sheffield being a lot more low rent, let's say, was just, we are chucking out council tenants to then get in, artists and academics. Here there was a thing of chuck out the council tenants, get in artists in between. Lots of the empty flats became artist studios for a time. And then you generate a buzz, you generate an interest in the area, an interest in the building. And then you kick them out in turn for people that can afford £1 million flat. And that's what's happening now. And this then, to use the phrase, cross-subsidizes the maintenance of social housing that is run by the same social housing landlord, Poplar Harker. So again, I can't help but think that the kind of evacuation of the social purpose of this building is something that was unnecessary, something that in a city that has dire need of social housing. I think probably the biggest need it's had for social housing since the 1940s. To do something like that seems to me to be idle, to put it politely. But kind of going along with this, in this case, unlike in Park Hill, most of the original fabric of the building has been very well preserved. There's been some annoyance at these windows from people that care a lot about that sort of thing. I think they're not as good as the original windows, but I don't really give a toss. So it's also an interesting one because of the fact that the architect, Erno Goldfinger, kind of saw it, again, as with Park Hill, very much as a social project. Moved into the original flats for a while to see what people liked and didn't like about them. And later, in the kind of second version of the building he built at Derelict Tower in Ladbroke Grove, he kept his office in the tower for most of the rest of his life. So kept in very close contact with these buildings and very much saw them as a social project, not as luxury flats. The public buildings, however, have always been much, much more easy to kind of renovate without problems, particularly in cities where there aren't the same aesthetic prejudices, let's say, as there are in e.g. Birmingham. I think Birmingham councillors very much were still in that kind of 70s, 80s world where this was the worst architecture ever, and weren't particularly interested in its newfound fashionability, whereas in London that has not been the case. The National Theatre, as you can see here, has been very, very nicely renovated, both inside and out. The renovation by Howard Tompkins is remarkably sympathetic to the building and manages to add new things that are still in the same spirit as that building. So it's something that's eminently possible with a public building, but it's something that hasn't happened pretty much at all in terms of housing in Britain. I can't really name a single renovation of a brutalist housing scheme in Britain that has managed to both retain the building's fabric and to retain its original social purpose. There are projects that have done one, and there are projects that have done the other. But to do both at the same time has been enormously difficult. And there are various reasons for that, I think. One of them is, in truth, aesthetic. The brutalism, and I should probably have talked about it a little more stylistically, but I'm sort of quite limited for time. Brutalism was very much kind of in that tradition from the 19th century of truth to materials. If something's made of concrete, you're supposed to be able to see that it is made of concrete. If something is made of steel, you see that it's made of steel, and so forth. The usual way in which you renovate in order to bring up the insulation standards, in order to, fix various problems with the services or whatever. The cheapest way of doing it is usually some form of cladding or some form of rendering. That way you can just slap it on the exterior, and it's very, very straightforward. You have to be careful when you're doing this that you don't clad it in material that's actually flammable, which is something which you would think was the most basic requirement, but apparently was beyond many of the local authorities and housing associations that have renovated housing in Britain for the last 10 years, which is why we've had to remove cladding from thousands of blocks in the aftermath of Grenfell Tower. But this does mean that when you're dealing with a listed brutalist building, you've got a question of insulating it from the inside, which is necessarily more complex. And you also have the question very much specific to the UK, I think, and to the US and to countries that don't really like to spend much money on public goods. You just have a simple question of funding. Sheffield City Council always claimed at Park Hill that they just simply couldn't afford to renovate it up to its original standard. And that's why they gave it to Urban Splash for £1. The difficult thing with that is that then the amount of money that's then been spent by the state in terms of, clearing the original building, taking out the original fabric, paying for its renovation, and later bailing out the property developer during the first phase of the financial crisis, meant that the state ends up spending loads of money to gentrify its own public good. The public sector ends up spending loads of money in order to pay for the kind of removal of one of its own assets. So this all sort of poses the question of, are there better ways of doing it? And in terms of housing, there are various models that one would point to. The renovation of a lot of the concrete panel housing of Eastern Europe, particularly in Poland and the Czech Republic and Slovakia, has actually been surprisingly good. This is really the kind of like most basic level modernist housing of huge concrete panels, flat roofs, endless facades. This stuff has actually been very, very well renovated, partly because of the fact that it's where the majority of people in a lot of cities live. So there's the possibility of demolishing it would be so costly that there's not really any much enthusiasm for that. But usually it's been renovated via kind of styrofoam and render, and it's necessarily loses the kind of the concrete texture of the original building, which is a problem with brutalism. There's a similar thing that could be said with the renovations of the French architectural firm Lacaton and Vassal, who have done wonderful renovations of council housing in Paris and Bordeaux in such a way that they have retained the original social fabric and original building fabric. No one's rent's been put up, no one's been decanted, it's not been privatized, but they've managed to add new flats and expand the size of them. It's really fascinating projects for which they deservedly won the Pritzker Prize. But they are necessarily, again, not really something that works with a brutalist building or a listed building, because you're transforming the fabric of the building. It no longer looks like the original building. So the example that I would point to, which is very recent, is the just completed renovation of a housing scheme outside Geneva called Le Lignon, which is essentially kind of a scheme. Sorry, this is a terrible picture. A scheme very obviously inspired by Park Hill. The Swiss architects of the scheme were members of Team 10, the same kind of architectural kind of clique that the Park Hill architects had contacts with, both inspired by the work of the architects Ellison and Peter Smithson, and both kind of based on trying to encourage, this sort of sense of mixed use, these different functions piled on top of each other, this kind of huge cliff of housing, and the use of these sort of so-called streets in the sky that are supposed to encourage, successfully or otherwise, community life. And the renovation of this building began about 9 years ago, and it's just been completed. And again, nobody was moved out. Nobody's rent went up, nobody was decanted, There was no strategy for bringing a better class or a different social class or whatever of people to the area. There was no kind of ideology with it of like, well, of course these buildings failed because people can't understand X, Y, or Z. There was none of this. Naturally, the process was very, very slow and very incremental and probably cost a fair bit of money. I think it would be interesting to kind of look at whether it cost more money than the partial renovation of Park Hill. I suspect when push comes to shove, it's probably quite similar. But the question I want to end on before I go to questions is, what is it in Britain that has made it very difficult to do things like this? And I think some of it is to do with ideology and the kind of various ideological criticisms which I brought in with the men standing in front of towers, slagging them off. And a lot of that ideology still has a lot of purchase in Britain, and it still has a lot of purchase of a particular generation of people in politics and in property development who I think very much still live in the 1980s and 1990s. Part of it is also about financial structures, the way that renovation is funded. There's a tax on renovation is taxed more highly in Britain than new construction, which makes no sense whatsoever. There's various things that make kind of the renovating of housing quite difficult. And a lot of the funding streams, lots of the money ends up going into the kind of labyrinthine structures of contracting and subcontracting that we have here, which also tend to go with very, very poor quality. So I think there's also just a simple thing in society of it being seen to be difficult to argue for these buildings as public goods. That just, there's a sort of cringe almost. People feel that they have to kind of go, well, we know that this happened and that happened, but can we please have some social housing, sir? There's a kind of lack of kind of full-throatedness and fearlessness and going like, no, this stuff is important. We think we should have it. We think we should still have it. And we think it's good. And that is often missing. And one of probably the good things about the sort of renewed fashionability of a lot of this architecture, most of which here was for social purposes, is that it has at least been celebrated as places. They've been, it's been a kind of enthusiasm for them. But too often what goes along with that is a kind of belief that, that the people that have the most right to live in it, let's say, are the people that are most enthusiastic for its architecture, which is not a view that its architects would have shared. Anyway, I've gone on a few minutes too long, so it's time for questions if anyone wants to ask any.
Hi, I'm reappearing to curate your questions. Thank you so much for your talk, Owen. It's been really interesting. I've been madly tweeting lots of different things that you said. I think it's interesting your point about, I'm just, as we're waiting, people, if they want to find the Q&A tab, it's just a tab that you select at the top of the chat. Or if you want, you can put the questions in the chat. I will monitor both. I think it's interesting the point you make about the ideological barrier, that inability to argue for these projects. Is there anything that happened around Grenfell that made that easier to make the case, or in fact did that just kind of become a sidetracked, or did that actually play into the idea that these projects are somehow dangerous on a or badly designed on a fabric level?
I think at first, like one of the first things that happened with Grenfell is that a lot of the knee-jerk responses from people like Sir Simon Jenkins and also from a lot of politicians was, well, we always knew these 1970s tower blocks were dangerous. And then when it became very clear from the initial assessment, and even more so from the ongoing inquest, that that's not what was going on at all, that has changed the debate a little bit. There is now an awareness that this was actually a perfectly safe building that had been made unsafe by a cheap and nasty renovation. And that I think has changed the debate a little bit, not changed it enough. I think probably the thing that has changed it the most is a combination of two things, really. One of which is just the changes in architectural fashion that are inevitable and happen endlessly. I mean, that everything becomes fashionable eventually. And the fact that that happens to have coincided with an enormous dearth of affordable housing. So in the US, where I think by and large, brutalism was a kind of, a sort of style for universities and state bureaucracies, and it's very rarely used in housing. There's not the same kind of, there's a slightly different idea about what brutalism is and was. Whereas here, the fact that so much of it was housing, and then we don't have any, has so much of it was affordable housing, and we don't have any affordable housing, it kind of adds an extra layer of kind of urgency to the debate.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit around stigma, because of course, when we're kind of operating on a stylistic level, we might be talking about, I think there is a sense that there is a stigma to living in a building or living in a brutalist building because it's associated with council housing. Of course, this idea that these places can be rebranded to be fashionable and luxury. So where is that stigma? Do you think it's a myth, something that didn't exist for the people who were there? Is it something that the rebranding has removed? I guess I don't have a clear thought around that, but I think it's as opposed to looking at it as a neutral style, whereas the style political. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly wasn't intended to be neutral, and was very much supposed to be a style for housing, and a style that can kind of be knocked about a bit as well. But the question of stigma, I mean, this is always a thing for council housing in any period. There's kind of like two contrasting ways you can deal with the question of doing non-market housing. You can do what, for instance, the city of Vienna did in the 1920s, which is just be very bombastic about it and be like, here is our council housing. There's a big sign on it saying council housing, and there's flags on top. We think it's amazing. There's that approach, which I think comes here with Quarry Hill in Leeds, and kind of runs very much through things like Park Hill, of just kind of celebrating it in a very kind of bombastic way. And then there's the kind of like, which draws attention to it. Even though what you're doing is, what you're trying to do is a statement of pride, you're drawing attention to the social housing. And that idea has been criticized a lot, including by people that I quite respect, like Lindsay Hanley or John Boughton, who are very good writers on council housing, because of the fact that it immediately could have put a spotlight on those people. And there's the other approach, which I guess, a lot of the kind of so-called cottage estates built in the 20s and 30s, or a lot of the new town housing built in the 50s and 60s, you can't really tell the difference between what's council and what's not. That approach, I think, is not entirely uninteresting, but whether or not it really brings less stigma, I'm skeptical, because when you have a situation in which everything, the kind of so much of the kind of country revolves around its property market, the something which everyone knows is not, is not housing that you've bought, signals that you're not a property owner. And if you live in a so-called property-owning democracy, which we apparently are, it basically says you're considered a second-class citizen in that democracy if you don't want to own property. And there's all sorts of ramifications of that. There's a great bit in John Grindrod's book Concretopia about Cumbrae Newtown, about how someone describes living in one of the kind of council estates of Cumbrae, and how a row of new houses were built opposite that estate, which were identical in almost every way. Because they were private, people in the council blocks opposite desperately wanted to be in those on the other side. And of course, these sorts of things are anecdotal, but I think that does point to a thing of like, when you have a kind of national obsession with property, that's going to happen. I think it happens a lot less in places where property ownership is not the norm. One reason why I think the stuff has fared better in continental Europe, but also one reason why it's fared a lot better in London, I think, is because the norm in lots of London is not to be an owner-occupier of a house. So that stigma has definitely been there at various points, but it's often changed and it's often shifted. again, Michael Roman's great book on the Aylesbury estate has some really good stuff on how, initially this was like the most high-end housing. That the people that kind of deserving poor of the Elephant and Castle we put in the Aylesbury estate with its lifts, its underfloor heating, its balconies, all mod cons, whereas poorer people and recent migrants would be stuck in 1930s walk-up tenements. So this was the creme de la creme, and later, I think the shift in architectural fashion that happens after that, and the exodus of a lot of those people from inner London to Kent and Essex and so on, then created in a society that is deeply divided by race and class. People would start looking at the buildings and assessing who they thought lived there in terms of race and class. And that's the solution to that is not architectural, I don't think.
No, we're getting back to the question of social and income inequality and perceptions and the division you point out between people who are citizens because they own their property and people who are slaves to the property market because they are rented. So until we kind of clear that up and have an equal sense of purpose and ownership. I've got 3 questions here for you in no particular order. So one is from Peter Smith, who says, you spoke about the shortcomings of the Lacaton and Vassal projects in that they change the appearance of the buildings, if he can put it that way as a shortcoming. At what point would you say the original aesthetic becomes something to be safeguarded?
I suppose my very neutral answer to that is, if the listing system has decided that it is, I think it's fair to say that it is. There are rules on what you do and don't do with listed buildings, which I think were flagrantly disregarded in the case of Park Hill. And necessarily you then have to do something different if you're wanting to kind of preserve the structure and appearance of a building, which you are if you've listed it. You have to do things a bit differently. So it's not really a question of the, most post-war housing, I think, could be treated like Lacaton and Vassal treated those buildings in Bordeaux and Paris, and I have no issue with that. I think to do the same thing with something like Balfron Tower is a different matter because of the fact that the kind of fabric of that building is what it's listed for. It's listed for the quality of its concrete. It's listed for its finishes. It's listed for its stained glass. Very much the same with Derelict Tower. They're listed for those material haptic qualities, which a Lacaton and Vassal style renovation would necessarily tear out. And that's not the case of most post-war housing. I don't think, I don't think it matters for most of it. But it does matter of, I guess, high brutalism, for want of a better word.
Tony Curvin wants to know whether the concern over carbon emissions and climate change, with the greater awareness about the need to think harder about the retention of existing buildings, is actually moving things in a new direction, and whether you've seen any evidence of this justifying the retention of a building.
Yeah, and here I think, this is a thing that I think is now quite widely acknowledged. The greenest building is the one that already exists, is the phrase that you often hear now, and I think that's by and large true. As an enthusiast for modern architecture, this pains me a little. There are many buildings I'd like to see demolished, and it does pain me a little to think that we can't demolish all of those ghastly Victorian terraces in Walthamstow. But this is definitely a factor, and here I'm not in the habit of praising either recent things in Eastern Europe or projects of the European Union, but they have done a phenomenally good job in the renovation of the kind of post-50s, 60s, 70s, 80s concrete panel housing there. And that was very much along green lines of, that these buildings were losing huge quantities of energy. They were very badly insulated, and then that was sorted, and people's energy bills have plummeted, people's energy use has plummeted, and they're very, in a very modest way, they're very successful green projects, and ones that we could really quite learn from, actually. So yeah, I think that's definitely a factor, and it was also a factor, I think, behind the so-called Decent Homes program that the government had in the 2000s. that renovated quite a lot of post-war buildings in a way that made them a lot more energy efficient, but also clad a lot of them with stuff that was flammable.
I think Benjamin asks a question about whether there's a perceived lack of green space around this type of architecture. But actually, I mean, we were talking about your piece, Jane Jacobs Says No, which really talked about how at Elephant and Castle and the Haygate estate, there was an incredible enclave of, a forest of trees they talk about. And it being, I think it'd be interesting to bring that Jane Jacobs story about streets and how these didn't have streets. And now we have the Create Streets movement, which again, is the challenge and the kind of tension between the modernist towers in a park and this brutalism being entangled in that. So I don't know if you want to comment about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, certainly, like a lot of the kind of hard line brutalism, like something like Park Hill. Park Hill's got a fair few trees, but it's not, it can be stark in places. I think one of the things that's happened in all of this, and here I blame the Tumblr, the very popular Tumblr, Fuck Yeah Brutalism, is the huge amount of photographs from the time that circulate. When people kind of, go to and look at brutalism on Instagram and what have you, so much of the time it's like, here is a wonderful photograph from 1965, which is usually from before the trees started growing. And by and large, certainly in London, a lot of the time the actual greenest places are the post-war housing estates. Some of them are incredibly green, particularly now that those trees have grown up. And a lot of them would have looked quite desolate in 1962. Now they don't. And I think one of my irritation with the kind of Create Streets idea, I think partly it's just all very facile, but I think it's there's a sort of letter spirit thing with Jane Jacobs, let's say. I have a very love-hate relationship with Jane Jacobs' stuff. And I think the kind of letter of it is like, she says you need to have, everything needs to be like Greenwich Village or Paris. It needs to be 6 stories, and it needs to have, an asphalt pavement, and it needs to have street blocks that are this wide. And that will then guarantee, exciting street life. And, we've all now seen in the last 20 years, new developments and redeveloped docks or along the Thames or in Manchester and Salford that follow every single one of those lines and are boring as hell. Like, we've all seen this. Like, these things are not a panacea. We've also all seen, if we're looking properly, places that break all of those rules that actually work, that create the kind of economies that she's talking about. And the Elephant and Castle, again, was a great example of that. It was a Jane Jacobs style economy, let's say. It was, the so-called mum and pop stores. It was, Colombian restaurants. It was the Polish cafe, the Irish bookshop, the bowling alley, and the bingo hall, and all of those things, which actually nowhere else in the area had really survived. All survived within this kind of modernist megastructure that had no kind of streets in the usual sense at all. And that's the thing that works in some ways with the fabric of the building. So the kind of structure of it was actually quite, when you're inside, was quite legible. And, it had these kind of high, airy kind of shop fronts and so forth. And it was quite easy to understand when you're inside it. It's quite a kind of nicely planned building. So it wasn't totally against the original design of it, but certainly took it somewhere which wouldn't have been predicted in the 1960s. So, I feel like on a topic.
No, I think what you were describing is actually, it is a lot of these photography is from, an early period of time where the trees were not grown. The trees had grown. And I asked you about Create Streets, and you were saying, look, these places had Greenwich Village type economies. They were just not in the kind of buildings that Jane Jacobs would have recognized. So Jane Jacobs, perhaps we shouldn't export her ideas to every location and think that actually, and actually not recognize what's already there, I suppose. If they'd done a proper audit about the types of independent shops and different kinds of size and type of business that were enabled to, which I imagine we are unlikely to see in the retail provision, perhaps outside of the market, which I think they've saved.
I suppose the interesting thing that's, so much kind of like big retail was already and like kind of chain restaurants and so forth were already in big trouble before the pandemic. Now they're all generally kept on life support by government grants, and they will all go out of business in the next few years. So there's an enormous kind of
big change coming.
yeah,
big change coming.
And I think places like the kind of Ward's Corner Market in Seven Sisters, or although it's quite hipstery, something like Peckham Levels or the Elephant and Castle before they demolished it. These are all very much examples of like interesting things you can do with that fabric that will actually make them work. As a real I think one of the most important things anyone interested in this stuff needs to do is just like go and look at things. Like you can walk along like Peckham Rye, along Rye Lane, and you will see so many buildings being kind of like reused and repurposed in all sorts of sort of like 1930s arcades and old sort of department stores and warehouses, and everything's being used sometimes by hipsters, sometimes by like the West African community, or all sorts of different people are all sort of using these spaces in ways that have very, very little to do with how they were designed, but that have usually kind of took something from that and made it work for them. And that's really, really commonplace, and it's got nothing to do really with what with this kind of very facile idea of like streets do this and blocks do that, and it's not how cities really work. And I think the interesting thing about this is just go and look at things, go and look at what's actually there, and pay attention to that.
Brilliant. Oh, and I'm afraid we have to let you go. I don't really want to, but we've just sent everybody to go and look at things. So it's a perfect moment. You can also go and look at Owen's book. I put a link in the chat with Verso Books. It's out, Clean Living Under Difficult Circumstances. And I just want to thank you for being here and for sharing this with us.
My pleasure.
So we are back here at 2:00 with public spaces. So come and join us then, and we'll see you. And feel free to join a table in the lounge, say hello to each other, and Owen, bask in your emoji, love. Thanks, everyone.